So, buenas tardes and good afternoon. On behalf of the Washington Office on Latin America and the National Security Archive, we would like to welcome you to this webinar on the lessons from Latin America as the U.S. reckons with enforced disappearance. We are aware that enforced disappearance is not codified in U.S. law as a standalone crime, but there is plenty of work at the international level codifying this very grave human rights violation. The International Convention to Protect All Persons from Enforced Disappearance defines this grave crime as, and I quote from the convention, any arrest, detention, or any form of deprivation of liberty by agents of the state or groups acting with the authorization of the state, followed by a refusal to acknowledge the deprivation of liberty or the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person. So to make it less technical, we're talking about at least three key elements. The deprivation of liberty, of course, abduction, kidnapping, detention, arrest. The involvement of government agents or those acting with state authorization, and the denial, the refusal to acknowledge or disclose the fate of the disappeared person. And I know this can all sound very technical, and it can sound like legal jargon. But if there is one thing we have learned in Latin America, is that the consequences, the impact of enforced disappearance are profoundly human. And sadly, when a person or a group of people disappear, the relatives, the families, the community, the society to which the disappeared person belongs to suffers greatly. And in Latin America, we know this feeling of agony. Unfortunately, we know it too well. So I want to close by offering three quotes from three different women in three different countries and in three different moments of history. My first quote is by Luz Encina, a Chilean, now in her late 90s. She said in an interview, "When I find something, some little thing, anything, I will feel better." She saw her son for the last time on August 1974, and she's still looking for him. Second quote is from a Mexican, Adela Alvarado Valdez. I quote, "It's been 11 years since Monica disappeared, and I refuse to forget about her. We didn't lose a dog, a car, or a bicycle, but a human being, my daughter, and I cannot abandon her." Adela is the mother of Monica Alejandrina Ramirez, who disappeared in the state of Mexico, north of Mexico City, a decade ago, 21st century. And the last quote is by Mariana González de Tudares. "Today is our son's birthday. It should be a day filled with joy, but his sad look says it all. His father, Rafael Tudares Bracho, is still missing. It's been 113 days. No gift can make up for his absence." This was published by Mariana, Rafael Tudares' wife, 6 hours ago on social media from Caracas, Venezuela. So if there is anything to take from these three quotes from three different women whose relatives and loved ones disappeared at three very different types of history in three very different countries, is that it really doesn't matter when a person was disappeared, in what context the person was disappeared, 50 years ago, 10 years ago, or 2 weeks ago. Enforced disappearance is painful. It is a tragedy for families, but also for societies. And it's not just a human rights violation. When a government commits enforced disappearance, when a government takes citizens or others in their territory outside of the protection of the law, this is a warning for democracy. And that is why we're here today. Because speaking about the painful lessons of Latin America to the United States is sadly now necessary. And I really thank Marcela, Mercedes, and Juan for being with us today. And of course, my colleague, Adam Isaacson from WOLA, and the great Kate Dole, who will be leading this webinar for agreeing, and for organizing together with WOLA, because we're doing all of this together, this conversation. To be very honest, I can tell you that just a few years ago, we probably never thought a webinar like this would happen. So since we are here, we need to discuss it and we need to understand what lessons we can learn. So with that, I give the floor to Kate Doyle, a senior analyst of U.S. policy in Latin America at the National Security Archive, who is a good and dear friend of WOLA and of many Latin Americans because of her extensive experience in the region, documenting for years, atrocities from what death squads did in Guatemala or El Salvador to genocide and other serious crimes under international law. So, Kate, the floor is yours, and everybody, once again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Carolina, and also our colleague, Adam Isaacson, with whom we really did put this thing together. Let me just make a very short reflection on why we're gathered here today, and then I will explain very simply the format of how we're going to talk and introduce our panelists one by one. First, our speaker, Mercedes Torretti, and later I will, when Mercedes is done, I will introduce Juan, and finally Marcela. But let's talk about what's happening today. The Trump administration's assault on immigrants has left many of us in the United States confused and dismayed. How do we make sense of this? It's impossible to read the actions of US government agents seizing men, women, and children for detention and deportation without due process through the lens of immigration policy. We have all seen the images of masked security forces swarming a student outside her home, a mother driving with her kids, workers in a restaurant kitchen. To take them where? ICE, DEA, ATF, CPB, local police, they don't always say where. They don't always inform their relatives that they've taken them. They don't always allow that person to contact their lawyer. They don't always bring them before a judge. And now they don't even always imprison them in the United States. For those of us working in Latin America, the actions of Trump's security forces ring a deeply disturbing bell. We can't help but connect what is happening in our country right now, today, to a long history in the Americas of the use by states of enforced disappearance to punish people considered dissidents. In Latin America, that could mean armed guerrillas or suspected subversives. More often, it meant students, professors, journalists, investigators, indigenous activists, opposition politicians, lawyers, priests. But if the region has a dark history of disappearing its perceived enemies, it also has a proud and powerful tradition of fighting back. People mobilized, they organized, They invented strategies to protest the disappearances, demand information, hold hearings, fight in courts, create new laws, search for the missing, expose injustice, and tell the rest of the world what was happening. That's why we've invited these three experts, these colleagues and friends, to speak to us today. These three people have direct experience with forced disappearance and its impact on society. We need to hear from them. We need to learn from their histories. We need to pull lessons from what they have to tell us about how to fight back here. I want to begin by introducing Mercedes Doretti to be our first speaker. And I want to pose two questions. Each of these two questions go to all three panelists, but we'll start with Mimi. And they have to do with two aspects of what's happening. First of all, can you help us understand what's happening in the United States by telling us about your own experiences with enforced disappearance? We think that will help give us context to comprehend what's happening in this country. And secondly, can you talk to us about how you, and maybe civil society more broadly, fought enforced disappearance in the country where you worked, demonstrating against it, exposing it, investigating it, debunking official lies, accompanying victims, influencing public opinion, and seeking international accompaniment, as well as holding perpetrators accountable. Again, we're hoping for lessons for you as civil society about what works and what the risks are. With that, I would like to formally introduce Mimi Doretti, a great friend from long back and a colleague to all of us who are working in the human rights space, not only in Latin America, but around the world. Mimi Doretti is a forensic anthropologist who unearths evidence of crimes against humanity, restoring voices to long silenced victims and presenting critical findings to tribunals, human rights organizations, and special commissions around the globe. She was born and raised in Buenos Aires and earned an advanced degree in anthropological sciences from the National University of Buenos Aires. As a student, Mimi co-founded the Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team, or AF, in 1984 to investigate the thousands of cases of men, women, and children who were disappeared under Argentina's military dictatorship from 1976 to 1983. Along with her colleagues, Mimi designed the team to be more than a group of forensic scientists. It became an internationally renowned human rights investigative body. Mimi has helped expose state responsibility in many of the world's most notorious human rights atrocities, from the 1981 El Mozote massacre in El Salvador to the 2014 disappearance of 43 Ayotzinapa students in Guerrero. Her work has resulted in awards, documentaries, and international accolades. It has also attracted surveillance and intimidation, most recently by the Mexican government, when she and other investigators, including our own Marcela Turati, were targeted by an espionage campaign because of their investigation of the San Fernando massacre. Today, Mimi is the executive director of AF, helping to oversee work underway in countries around the world from her home base in New York City. Mimi Doretti.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that introduction. And good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, Walla and the National Security Archive for inviting me to be part of this conversation. So as Kate mentioned, I was born in Argentina, born and raised there, but I'm based in the United States. I'm a forensic person and part of a team that for the past 4 decades have been applying forensic sciences to the investigation of human rights violations and humanitarian problems. And usually we do more technical talks than this one, but it seems appropriate that today and necessary, the need to remember earlier experiences, like living in a dictatorship, even if it's not a very easy exercise. As Kate mentioned, and many of you probably know, Argentina went through a dictatorship between 1976 and 1983, where thousands of people were disappeared by the state. They disappeared as they became known. We typically taken to more than 300 state-run illegal detention centers located all over the country, tortured, and then either they will be released or killed. In this last case, they will be buried as Jane or John Does in cemeteries along the country, or in clandestine graves in military or police precincts, or dumped from airplanes into the Argentinian Sea while sedated. Several hundred children were also taken with their parents or were born in those illegal detention centers in captivity and given as biological kids to law enforcement and military families, while the real biological parents were typically killed by the regime. Thousands of people went into exile. Many political prisoners detained during the previous democratic regime were expelled from the country. Like many authoritarian regimes, the last Argentinian dictatorship chose to use enforced disappearance as its main repressing tool to get rid of what was left of armed groups, armed political groups, political opposition, labor unions, students, activists, and any kind of dissent, among other reasons, to avoid due process. When asked about the disappeared people, the military government will deny their existence or talk about their alleged crimes. However, we learned that the most serious problem was not the alleged crimes that an individual may or may not have committed. A functioning legal system can take care of that. The main problem was that the state was the perpetrator and that it was eliminating the rule of law. So the state hid the disappeared while they were alive in illegal detention centers and then hide their bodies when they were killed while denying the crimes and the state responsibility on these crimes. All these hallmarks of enforced disappearance. This denial of the state of the mere existence of the disappeared, particularly during the first years of the dictatorship, created a sense of confusion, of void, even of madness. People will be kidnapped in front of their relatives, friends, or bystanders by law enforcement agents or the military. But when their families went to state institutions to ask for them, officials will deny that such events occurred. The judiciary was not investigating. So where do you go to inquire about your missing loved ones when the state is the perpetrator? What do? Are you maybe confused about what you saw, or could there be another explanation? Is it probably a confusion that will soon be solved? Moreover, in Argentina, military government, like in other authoritarian regimes, reversing the responsibility of disappearances on the disappeared individual actions or on his or her family or social context is very common. That was the case in Argentina, where the state advertised phrases like, "Do you know where your kids are? This is actually happened to your child because she or he was involved in something. If he or she was not involved in anything, then nothing would have happened. Nothing would have happened to them if you would have taken well care of them. Essentially, it's your fault." Finally, at that time, most of South America had military governments or authoritarian regimes and prisoners, and prisoners and disappeared people were exchanged as part of the so-called Plan Condor or Operation Condor, an agreement signed in 1975 by several South American countries to conduct these exchanges in a clandestine way, giving local enforced disappearances a regional, transnational dimension. Enforced disappearances are used not only to avoid due process, but also to spread terror. When the state no longer respects the rule of law, we are all in danger. We can all be accused at any time of being a criminal, a terrorist, or any other name, since nothing needs to be verified. Back then and now, we all know that no one actually disappears. It is just not an existential status. We are either dead or alive. And in cases of enforced disappearance, state agents or the state are responsible. And it's in their power to remove the disappeared from that parallel limbo universe and make them visible again, make them human again, bring them back to their families and society as a whole. Authoritarian regimes typically create their own rules or twist current ones. They're usually arbitrary, illegal, unpredictable, change often, and they are purposely often vague in their norms wording and scope so that they can be used in many different circumstances. But they all serve to paralyze people. This uncertainty of when we can be seen as the enemy can create terror and paralyze us. Fear and silence descended quickly over all of us on those first days of the Argentinian dictatorship. Somehow we immediately knew we could no longer talk openly about many things, or we can only talk with very close friends in a low voice. Like pain, fear may be inevitable. And I guess it's not necessarily a bad thing per se. It's mostly an alert sign. And what we do with it or despite it, it's a different story. Back in Argentina during the dictatorship, the need to control the entire society and eliminate dissent included all political parties, union, all political activities, placing military personnel or civilians loyal to the regime in charge of TV stations, radio stations, universities, factories, industries, and so on. So during those first months, language, culture, and communication changed dramatically. Some words were key to the government discourse. For example, anybody with left-wing ideas or simply against the dictatorship was a subversive or a terrorist, someone that was against Western civilized Argentinian Christian values, whatever that means. The military government publicly called itself the national reorganization process. List of words, songs, books, movies were forbidden. State censorship and self-censorship were widespread. I guess the concept of Hannah Arendt about the banality of evil inevitably apply at many levels of society when you implement something of this dimension. I was 17 years old when the dictatorship started in Argentina, and I was in my last year of high school. I started and ended my initial education as an anthropologist at the State University of Buenos Aires during the military government. Social sciences were seen by the dictatorship as a focus of left-wing subversive ideas. The deans and professors from most state universities, and there were very few private ones at that time, have to comply with new curricula. Some careers like sociology were closed, period. Anthropology had a very restricted acceptance range, 40 students a year only. And I entered during that year, and the following year, the acceptance was closed. They call it zero entrance. Content and pedagogy methods were changed too. We were not allowed to read or talk about major authors, like Lévi-Strauss, for example, because they were considered subversive. The anthropology we studied stopped in the 1930s. The whole decolonization, for example, process in Africa and Asia that took place in the 50s and 60s, and that greatly criticized the old anthropological model linked to colonial times, was not existent. I received an encyclopedic education where memorizing was predominantly present and where reflecting and free writing was the exception. Many professors were fired then, and also on a previous military government and during an authoritarian period of the previous, even democratic government. But meanwhile, families of the disappeared start finding each other on the corridors of state institutions, asking for their loved ones. When they compared their stories, they saw a whole repressive status apparatus acting behind each individual case. They understood that they were not crazy and that they were not alone. They organized themselves into associations of families of the disappeared. To make the issue of disappearance more visible, while knowing that public protest was forbidden by the dictatorship, they decided to start walking around the monument of the Plaza de Mayo, facing the presidential building every Thursday, every week. they decided that only the mothers in each family will do this because they were more, and the husbands will stay reading, pretending to read the newspapers on benches around the square because they were more likely to be arrested by the police. The mothers will have a white handkerchief in their heads with the names of their missing loved ones and carry often their photos. That was the beginning of the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo. When sharing their stories, some of them also realized that they were looking not only for their sons or daughters, but also looking for their grandchildren. And that was the beginning of the abuelas or grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo. Very courageous human rights lawyers, very few independent journalists, and very few local organizations work with families during the dictatorship, trying to establish and documenting what was happening. It was indeed extremely dangerous. In fact, several of the first leaders of the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo were disappeared by the military government, as were lawyers, journalists, priests, and others that tried to provide a voice or to help on specific cases. All of them also look for international attention, contacting foreign press, intergovernmental bodies like the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, the United Nations body, friendly governments, religious leaders, and so on, to try to intervene and to document what was happening. And through these actions, they created what we would call today a human rights ecosystem of families, lawyers, NGOs, activists, journalists at the national and international level to make possible for the general public in Argentina and abroad to know what was happening. So the initial fact-finding case documentation came from civil society, challenging the official story. After a few years, when the dictatorship started to collapse and had to call for presidential election, the human rights movement also managed to put the investigation of human rights violations of the dictatorship as part of the political agenda of the presidential candidates of all political parties. Candidates had to provide answers of what would they do if they win about what happened during the dictatorship. In 1984, on those early days of democracy, the Grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo and the then newly formed National Commission to Investigate Disappearances, called the CONAREP, contacted Eric Stover, then in charge of the Human Rights and Science Department of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. In one hand, they wanted to know if the IIIS could help them on creating a genetic method that could establish a likelihood of a biological relationship between children and grandparents, and in the absence of their parents. And on the other hand, they requested help for the search, recovery, and identification of the remains that may belong to disappeared people. A delegation of scientists was put together by the IIIS, and they came to Argentina. Among them was Clyde Snow, a famous US forensic anthropologist. Dr. Snow asked for Argentinian anthropologists and archaeologists to help him with exhumation and analysis of remains at municipal cemeteries that could belong to disappeared. For a number of reasons, graduates did not get involved, and he ended up with a group of advanced anthropology and archaeology and medical students like myself, and to help him fulfill judges' request. Dr. Snow stayed for the next 5 years in Argentina, trained us, helped us to form our team, and we went together with him into many international forensic missions for the next 20 years. Pretty soon we realized we were facing two problems that we will see not only in Argentina, but in many other countries as we start working in other countries, particularly in South America when democracy returned. One was a technical problem related with the recovery and identification of remains. Forensic anthropology and archaeology were not part of forensic services, and forensic pathologists typically work with cadavers, so they didn't have experience on how to analyze skeletal remains with identification purposes, and also on how to recover commingled remains from very large mass graves. And the second problem was a trust one. Families of victims and often society as a whole did not trust anymore state institutions. So because they see them as being part of the system that was responsible for the disappearances or to lie about it. And they consider that as part of a conflict of interest that did not making them not suited to be trusted by families of victims. To build a new bridge of trust, we understood that we needed to work in a different way than how a forensic person normally works on an individual criminal case. Also, the families of victims were not under suspicion of committing these crimes, like it would be the case under an individual regular criminal investigation. In this case, they were also victims, have suffered enormously, and we needed to listen to them, not only to find information about their loved ones, but also to understand how to accommodate our own work to not produce any unnecessary additional harm. This dialogue with families of victims also made us know more and understand better what it means to have someone disappeared in a family. So in 1984, we started assisting Dr. Snow, and then as expert witnesses working on our own legal cases. And in 87, we found the Argentine forensic anthropology team. Our main goal was to contribute physical evidence to the search for truth and justice. We developed methods to work on forensic and human rights cases that included to put the families at the center of our work, to work with them, and to be completely transparent about our findings as part of building again a bridge of trust on investigations. We became also a non-governmental forensic nonprofit organization so that we could be a technical independent voice, not submitted to changes on governmental political agendas. We also became part of this human rights ecosystem that I was mentioning before, of investigative partners working with lawyers, journalists, national and international association, and families. In order to search for the disappeared, we not only needed also to do actual forensic work, but also we realized we needed to investigate what the state have not investigated, or the judiciary, which was, in our case, all the state bureaucratic institutions related with records with recording death, like morgues and cemetery records, death certificates, and registry office, among others, indirect sources of information. Then we will cross with background information from and forensic evidence that we'll gather from families or from our own investigations.
Mimi?
Yes.
If you wrap up, I know we're going to come back to you with so many questions, because so much of what you've said so far just, it speaks to what we are experiencing here in a kind of chilling way.
Yeah. So working on with this strategy and working always for us on this human rights ecosystem has been so far the most effective way to do our work. And we hope that maybe that might be something helpful to consider in what's going on in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was almost like too close to home, listening to your descriptions of how language changed and the pressure within universities and outside universities not to speak about certain subjects. It's really astonishing. And thank you for describing that experience. Before I move to Juan, who's going to give us our next reflection, I wanted to say two things that I should have said up front. First of all, I just want to welcome everybody who is listening and watching. One of the awkward, alienating things about Zoom is we can't see you. You can see us, but I do see a little number down by the participants piece on the bottom of the screen that says there are 434 of you. So thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation. And I do want to let you know that you will have a chance to ask our three panelists questions when their presentations are done. Adam will field your questions and direct them to the speakers so that we can hear from all of you that want to get a question in there. Thanks so much. And thanks again, Mimi, for that. So let me introduce Juan Mendez before he begins his presentation. Juan is a human rights hero, a giant in the field of international human rights and humanitarian law, one of the world's preeminent experts on torture, and a leading voice in the call for the prevention of genocide. His long career is impossible to encompass in a brief introduction, but highlights would include his roles as director of the Americas Division of Human Rights Watch, as special advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, a member and then president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and president of the International Center for Transitional Justice. He was a special advisor to UN Secretary General Kofi Annan on the prevention of genocide, and in 2010 was appointed UN Special Rapporteur on torture. He's currently professor of human rights law in residence at American University's Washington College of Law. Awards, books, multiple teaching positions. If you want to know more, Google him. But know this, Juan is not only an inspiration to all who work in the field of human rights, he's also a survivor. His life's work began in his country of origin, also Argentina, where as a young lawyer, he represented political prisoners until he himself was effectively disappeared, arrested by the dictatorship, held in clandestine detention, and tortured. The experience shaped him, motivated him, and transformed him into the human rights champion that he is today. So Juan, I invite you to address basically the same questions as Mimi by giving us, some context about enforced disappearance to help us understand what's underway in the United States and talk about how you and people around you fought back. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you especially for those kind words of introduction. I also want to express my gratitude to Washington Office on Latin America and the National Security Archives for inviting me to share some views on this and congratulate both of the organizations for the idea of bringing this kind of experiences to light as we face these problems of arbitrariness in enforcement of immigration policy. I'm also very honored to share the panel with Mimi and Marcela, and I'm very appreciative that Mimi has basically described the phenomenon of disappearance, especially in Argentina, but elsewhere, in such detail that spares me from having to explain a lot of things. But I'd like to start with my own experiences, and especially the period shortly before the 1976 coup d'etat in Argentina, because for about a year and a half before that, the country was governed by an elected government, but one that became increasingly authoritarian, and in fact established a state of emergency, state of siege, as it's called in our constitution, as early as November of 1974. But obviously, the state of siege allowed the government to arrest people and don't release them immediately. But it also marked the beginning of death squads and kidnappings that then, in many cases, ended with corpses strewn around in parks and in abandoned places, with signs saying this is for doing this or for doing that, and for being enemies of the state, etc. So I was a practicing lawyer at the time, and it was very, very difficult to counter this. Fortunately, there were several of us all over the country who were willing to do this work as soon as families and others reported to us that somebody had gone missing. It was the practice of the law enforcement bodies at that time very clearly assisted by the armed forces as well, was to detain people without warrant and to move them around, transfer them from detention center to detention center, which made it very difficult for families to know where their loved ones were, but also for lawyers to locate them, and even for courts to be able to issue writs of habeas corpus to locate the person and determine whether the detention was lawful or arbitrary. Because even under the state of siege, the detention had to have at least some rationale behind it. So that was the work that us lawyers needed to do in very difficult conditions, going from police detention center to police detention center, knocking doors of judges in the middle of the night. And of course, as you can imagine, in time, it became even harder to get this done. But at least at that time, there was still the possibility of getting a good judge to do the kind of work that I'm discussing. And it was not altogether that difficult to locate the whereabouts of someone who had just been detained or had been detained a few days earlier. That basically meant that we could interrupt the torture sessions. Almost everyone was tortured at the time, at a time when it was still possible to save their lives and also to spare them that kind of suffering. But as you can imagine, after the coup of March of 1976, that was the kind of thing that was not possible to do anymore. Because at that time, the military forces that took over the country established this policy of disappearance, this practice and policy of disappearance that became the hallmark of the repression under the most recent military dictatorship in Argentina. As you said, Kate, by then I was already in custody myself. So I didn't work so much on cases of permanent disappearance, but I did have the experience of joining many other people in the prison where I was held who had been disappeared, like me, for a few days. Actually, in my case, I was one who, thanks to my lawyers and my family, my clandestine detention lasted only a few days, but in many other cases, it could last easily a couple of weeks or more. And especially after the coup, because I remained in prison after the military coup for another year, many people who had been arrested after the coup and held in clandestine detention centers and concentration camps around the country came to the prison where I was held, so I could hear their stories, their tales of what had happened to them and how they had survived it. In Argentina, the largest number of the disappeared are permanent disappearances. So, but there is still a number, and thankfully, the number of people who survived is enough to establish a pattern of what really happened in those places, and we have very valuable testimony from survivors of the disappearances. But at the same time, I wanted to highlight the fact that in Argentina and in other countries, we're talking about a permanent situation of someone whose fate and whereabouts sometimes for months, sometimes for years, and sometimes for decades, remains unknown. But we're also talking about people who are temporarily disappeared. And temporary disappearance basically is also, contemplated in international law as Carolina was saying earlier. International law has a very good normative framework describing disappearances, and it includes both permanent and temporary disappearances, in both cases as a very, very serious human rights violation. So when we're talking about disappearances, we still I mean, temporary disappearances, we're still engaging with the factors that Carolina described. State agents conducting the clandestine arrest, and people being held without being registered and without notifying families, and particularly held in incommunicado detention, that is, without the ability themselves to call their families, to alert them to what's going on, or to call a lawyer to get legal advice. And this practice of transferring people from detention center to detention center is also a hallmark of disappearances, as condemned and regulated by international human rights law. I also want to mention the fact that I was lucky enough to be expelled from Argentina relatively early on. I spent 18 months in custody, but at least because of international solidarity, I was able to be released much sooner than many others who were in exactly my same legal and practical situation. And so when I came to the United States in 1977, I immediately joined what we now call the human rights movement, and I was able to learn about, first to mobilize as much as I could and mobilize friends and colleagues in favor of people who were disappeared in Argentina, or who were disappearing, because of course in those years there were still disappearances were still raging in Argentina and in Chile and in Uruguay, and I would say especially in Guatemala, which seems to have inaugurated the practice of disappearances even before the Southern Cone. But in that capacity, I was able eventually to join the human rights movement. As you mentioned, Kate, I was I worked for Human Rights Watch on Latin American countries, and that also took me to different countries where disappearances were also a part of the picture, and eventually allowed me to participate in representation of the families of the disappeared in the landmark case of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights called Velázquez Rodriguez versus Honduras, where the Inter-American Court, in no uncertain terms, said that disappearances are a crime against humanity, and describes the features of disappearances in the same way that we have been describing it, including the state agency on disappearances, but also the clandestine nature of the places where people are kept. And it also describes disappearances both in terms of permanent disappearances, where the fate, we all agree, has to be considered the death of the person, but also temporary disappearances, which I think is a phenomenon that we don't necessarily associate with disappearances, although the international law does very much, condemn it, and also I would like to say that international law now, with the conventions on disappearances that many countries have signed and ratified, and with mechanisms to fight disappearances in the Inter-American system, but also in the universal system of human rights protection, including special rapporteurs on disappearances, working group on disappearances, but also treaty bodies like the Committee on Disappearances. And so we have a very good, legal framework that it actually is informed by what we learned the hard way by having to fight disappearances and to go side by side with relatives who were looking for their sons and their husbands and wives and daughters, and they were trying to locate them, but also to return to them their status as members of society and individuals whose dignity should not be ever taken away from. So I think this international legal framework allows us to condemn practices, and also it does establish certain obligations that states have. And one of them, of course, is to register detentions the minute they happen and not delay any time. Second, to not ever to use places of detention that are kind of close to the public and unknown to the public. Third, to let the institutions of the state, particularly the judiciary, know about the detention, so that an analysis of whether it's warranted or not can be made. But most importantly, to allow the person deprived of liberty for the possibility of communicating with family and with lawyers of their own choosing. All of that is essential to combat disappearances, both temporary and permanent. But I also think that, just as Mimi was saying, even that is not enough. We also need mobilization. We need civil society. We need every man and woman who cares for the fate and whereabouts of every other human being to have their voices heard, have their voices resonate, so that the state pays a price for violating the human rights of people they perceive as opponents, or for any other category in which disappearance, the policy of disappearances is used. And finally, I want to say that perhaps we don't really need to describe what happens to the person who is under disappearance, because everybody can imagine what it is. But I have to say that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in Velázquez Rodriguez versus Honduras classified the disappearances as a crime against humanity for very good reason. When it is a widespread or systematic attack on the civilian population, it is a crime against humanity. And those people who are responsible for it will sooner or later have to face criminal prosecution for engaging in this kind of detention. And I also would like to say, and with this I'll finish, that disappearances are torture as well, because the person who is deprived of contact with the family, the person who doesn't know what's going to happen to him or her, the person who doesn't know when this detention will end, the person who is in incommunicado detention, perhaps even in solitary confinement somewhere where nobody knows where they are, that person is being inflicted pain and suffering of a mental nature, even if no physical torture may be happening, of a serious enough nature that makes it meet the definition of torture that we all agree on, and that it is a violation of the Convention Against Torture, of which the United States is also a party. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan. There were so many concrete lessons to be had from what you just said, and we really appreciate that. I just would note that both Mimi and Juan have pointed to this sort of creating expertise in a field where there was none. And that's something that I think we need to think about here in the United States as well. We don't have expertise in this. We need to create it. Let me now introduce our third and final panelist, Marcela Turati. And after Marcela speaks for about 15 minutes, then we will open the floor for questions with Adam's help. And I see there's already some good questions flowing in. So thank you so much for that, audience. Marcela. Marcela Turati is one of Mexico's finest investigative journalists, a winner of multiple press awards, including the Maria Moores Cabot Prize, and a co-founder of the investigative nonprofit Quinto Elemento Lab. Her career as a reporter with Proceso magazine and other Mexican media has always centered human rights, social development, and the impact of state repression and drug violence on its victims. In 2007, she founded Periodistas de a Pie, Journalists on Foot, a journalism network dedicated to supporting reporters covering conflict, defending freedom of expression, and training colleagues in ethics, personal safety, and cybersecurity. Marcela's own reporting is increasingly focused on people missing and disappeared in Mexico. She did some of the most vital reporting on the Ayotzinapa case, for example, and she currently serves as a coordinator of a major investigative project called ¿A dónde van los desaparecidos? Where did the disappeared go? Marcela has edited and written several books, most recently, the astonishing San Fernando, Última Parada, Last Stop San Fernando, an account of how organized criminals targeted and killed travelers bound for the Texas border with almost total impunity, and an almost unbearable commentary on the indifference and cruelty of the Mexican government authorities. Lucky for us, San Fernando is right now being translated into English for publication in the United States, so we'll be able to read it sometime very soon. Marcela, welcome.
Thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. And thanks, WOLA and National Security Archive, and Mimi, Juan, Kate, Adam, and Caro. I have been covering the disappearances since 2001, when in Mexico we tried to investigate the victims of the so-called Dirty War. But since 2006, when the President Felipe Calderón declared the war on drugs, the disappearances are generalized, are systematic. Now we have more than 27,000 people in Mexico disappear. No? So it's huge. And I want to transmit or to share what I have learned covering this the disappearances. First, we didn't know as journalists how to cover this. No, it was like we didn't know as the relatives. No, we were in the confusion. What is this? What is happening? Whom are the victims? So first is this confusion that is always that, I don't know, is prolonged. It's really difficult to understand even now that we have like more, almost 20 years investigating to understand and to explain what is happening, no? It's important to know that the government always is pointing or stigmatizing the victims. It's always like saying it's because they made something bad, maybe they are criminals, maybe they provoked the tension, or so this is one of the things creating this confusion and this uncertainty are the it's really difficult for the relatives to do something. To first, you don't know where to go, how you can name this, if this is a detention, if it's a kidnapping, it's abduction, you don't know. So In Mexico, for example, at the beginning, we said it was a levantón, like a pick up or get up. I don't know what is the translation. The people were levantados, no? And not disappeared. With the time, we journalists understand that it's really, really important to name the things as they are, no? These are disappearances because this is important because the government have to explain these disappearances. They have to explain, and the government have responsibilities in the international level. If for that reason, we have to change and to learn how we can refer or write about this, no? So I was telling the first, we don't know if this were temporary, if the people made something wrong, it is kind of the rule of law and we don't know everything. Later, we saw also that the families, the relatives, didn't know what to say, you know? The other question is, it will affect me if I denounce? I have, what if I protest loudly and my parent will be punished, no? So the first days or weeks, almost months or years, many times the relatives are only like in this confusion and fear, not knowing what to do. If it is good for the victim or for the people who was disappeared to say it loudly or not, no? And what I have learned, the most important in Mexico is, for me as journalist, is to stay close to the victims. And in Mexico, we had an experience that it was really, really important. Since 2010, I think, some human rights NGOs and some of the collectives of the victims, the new collectives of mother searching for their relatives, they come together and they say they did some workshops to exchange different information. First, to try to understand what was happening, no? The data, to try to find patterns, that was important. So we can detect that in the north of Mexico, we have a lot of people disappearances and which characteristics or have these new victims, no? Also, the relatives create their own networks, bonds, ties with other organizations, no? And we together try to give or to bring sense of what was happening, no? We also having people from other countries who explain us, for example, Mimi was there, who explain us how this have been, what have happened in Argentina, in Chile, in Colombia, how we can name this, or what others have learned about this, about the disappearances. Also, this was a space to process psycho-emotionally what was happening, more in the psychological and emotional way, because it's really, really important that the victims also have this kind of spaces where they can talk about what is happening, because it is the start of a really long process of asking justice, no? And they can have to be, and we all have to be like really strong. Also, we start like seeking these patterns and finding that there are some mechanisms of the state have some mechanisms to create this confusion, to stigmatize, to evade their own responsibility, no? Other thing that is important is the spread the rights everybody have as human beings. Many times we don't know that we have some rights, no? Because for us it's really new. So this about the legal framework, the international mechanisms, how to push governments or to do something, or what the victims can do in the another levels, no? Later, no. And also we can see that this is a path, long path full of obstacles and lies. The government always is trying to hide information. The government is always trying just to lying, saying, naming this in a different way. No, it's not a disappearances. Is other thing. Maybe they are criminals. They deserve to be in jail. But the people has rights. No, have rights, and we have to remember all the time and use this, all the information, the data that we have to protect and to prevent and to fight. No, this is a really long process, and the families, the relatives lose the innocence. They feel disappointed about their own government, and it's also that is really difficult to process. It's really difficult to losing the faith in your government, knowing that the government is against you, no, and the rules are different. So, and you have to be prepared for that reason. Is really, really important. This about creating connections and creating networks. For example, with journalists, we created our own collectives and our own networks. We have a network of journalists who cover disappearances. So in these groups, we share information, sources, and we train ourselves in these topics, how to understand what is happening, how to investigate it, how to name it, no? Because it has different impact. It depends how you name it. Is the responsibility of the government how to take care of ourselves, of our also of the people that we interview, how to take care of the information that we collect, and the survivors also. It is really important, the people who are witness, how we can take care of the witness, no? How to interview victims also is really important. So we have to move, or we learn to move, or try to move from confusion to complexity, giving data, bringing data, joining different data. We create relationships with human rights defenders, forensic anthropologists, historians, therapists, and also and mainly the same relatives of the victims are really, really important, because they are the one who teach us what is happening, because they investigate a lot, no? So also as journalists, we all the time we are questioning ourselves, what is needed, how we can help relatives in this process, what information we can, we as journalists have access, a normal public don't have. So what information is needed that we can find. And for example, we created a chatbot. Socorro bot is the name. It's in WhatsApp, and it's a chatbot that, and with another organization of data organizations. And in this chatbot, we help people when somebody's disappear in Mexico. This is giving you the instructions of where to go, which are your rights, where is the address of the Procuraduría or Fiscalía, what kind of files you have to fill, also where the relatives, other relatives close to the place where your relative was disappeared, who can help you in that, for this moment. So this is like a quick response to when somebody say that my son is not answering the phone. So we immediately, we have this chatbot giving instructions of what to do. No, also we find data, for example, the mass graves or unidentified bodies data that we publish, and we do memorials for the victims. Always we try that the people understand that the victims are not, that have rights, and it's not a problem, even if it is a criminal, it has rights, and it has not to be disappear, and it's not it that the government have some rules. There are rules of law that the governments have to, the states have to take care of. And also, as investigative journalists, we find patterns that this is really important. It depends of what is what we are talking about. It's important that we are investigating the whole time, finding or trying to find patterns to give to the people more information, and also always analyzing the public servants in charge of these, or the public policies, the census, how the government always try to hide the numbers or hide information. And also training ourselves to, and asking for help. For example, the EAF, Mimi has give us some trainings, or asking to National Security Archive some help to use FOIA. And it's really important to understand the circuits of disappearances, the places of these, where the people, for example, in the Dirty War, where the people were transferred, the different places, the connection with authorities. That is one of the investigations that we are doing now from this is an investigation of how the government acted in the 70s, and disappearing people, but now also in the rancho of Teuchitlan, where 1 month ago we found this center of extermination, with many clothes and shoes. And so we, with other journalists, always working in network, we are trying to see, okay, with this place is what part of the chain, the circuit of disappearances, this place, what is the role of this place, how this is connected, what happened in each one of these stops, or these places where the people disappear.
Merci.
Yes.
So let's wrap yours up, because I see that there are already 25 questions in the little question bot. And I just want to say that your experience, which is so current and contemporary, is connecting so perfectly with experiences that Mimi and Juan were talking about from 25, 30, 40 years ago. It's like, it's reinforcing this idea that we need to learn from each other on what strategies to come up with to deal with. I especially love your chatbot idea to create a WhatsApp group. This is something we could do here among some of the migrant aid mutual support groups, and other organizations. So I thank you for that. Do you want to say one last thing as a concluding line before I cut you off and turn to Adam for the questions?
Yes, only the
Yeah.
enforced disappearances is when the state or the public servants are involved in this crime of disappearances. But also, you can talk about enforced disappearances when the public servants don't prevent, allow these disappearances, don't investigate when the people present a denounce, and don't do what the government must do. So it's not only that the army abducted or the army that makes some detentions. It's also the enforced disappearance also is about when the state don't do what must that is obligado to do, no? That.
100%. That is exactly right. And I think that's a really good lesson for us as well, because, you know, Juan was addressing this. Forced disappearance doesn't only take one form. It's not only when the military disappears someone and that person never shows up again. It can be a temporary disappearance. It can be a disappearance by an organized criminal group that the military or police either colluded with or never investigated. The state has that obligation as well, as you say. So I think that's really helpful to us because we're seeing a completely different form of disappearance here, but equally urgent to address by civil society. So thank you so much, Marcela. Also Juan and Mimi, thank you so much for your initial statements. Now, we only have 15 minutes left or even less to this session. And there are now 30 questions in the box. I'm going to turn this over to Adam to open up the round of questions, but I want to ask the three of you and Carolina, would you be willing to stay for 15 extra minutes to listen to more questions? And if one of you has an obligation, we could just stick with whoever remains. I mean, I just love to keep the conversation going if you're willing to do that. I don't know if you can. Juan? Okay, great. Mimi, is that okay with you? Marce, is that okay with you as well?
Sorry.
15 minutos, 15 minutos.
Yes.
Okay. Muchas gracias, Marcela. Bueno, Adam, let me turn over the round of questions to you, and maybe you can get us started with your own question.
Sure. I guess I can stay an extra 15 minutes too. I should just clarify at the beginning, a lot of people have been asking whether this will be available later. Yes, we will have the video on YouTube and hopefully embedded. I will make sure that it's embedded in the original event page for this, and I'll share it on social media. It should be. We're going to do our best to make sure this video is unavoidable for people. Okay, so we have more questions than we can get to. We clearly designed this event for a smaller group, but I will do my best. And clearly, this is a sign that we should make this a series as resources allow to have more of these discussions. I'm going to do a very really insultingly bad job of trying to combine many of the themes that were raised in the questions here into one sort of mega question to sort of launch you off. And I want to focus more on not as much on research and the legal or judicial aspect of this, but as the communications and storytelling and audience reaching aspect of this, which is what a lot of activists and a lot of groups like ours often end up doing. So, you know, in that area, I mean, what are some of the tools the human rights ecosystem has? We can talk about the justice system. And Luis Bernal had a question about, you know, in a country that still has a relatively independent justice system. Juan Mendez talked about this a lot too, that you could still find judges you could work with. That's something. But you know, right now, even our own courts are having a very hard time getting straight answers out of the Trump administration, and they're having a hard time even having their orders complied with unless they're super specific in those orders. There's the Inter-American system. Christina Mani asks, and I think there's other questions about the Inter-American system. Of course, the United States doesn't recognize the jurisdiction in a way that is binding on it, but it is still a space. We have a legislature here that is somewhat independent, but really I think we're in a situation where our Congress, all we can do now is build capacity and educate people for later action. Right now, as we hold this event, the House Judiciary Committee is drawing up legislation that will throw $45 billion at detention and $14 billion into deportation, among other similar items. So they're headed in a different direction in our legislature now, which really throws us into, you know, there was a question from somebody from Chile, Jimmy Teethan, saying, could we fight for laws? Eventually, yes, but we have to prepare the groundwork. And how do we do that right now then? I mean, there's a lot going on in the courts, but then bringing back to my question about communications, Pamela Yates asked, sort of, how do we nip this in the bud while our society is largely free before it gets worse? And others asked, I think Natalie Cadwallader asked, when the victims are non-citizens and they have less privileges than those of us who are citizens, you have a population that is in much less danger than the other for now. How can we use communications and storytelling to sort of represent those who cannot represent themselves right now because of the retribution that they are more likely to get as non-citizens? Should they organize or should they speak up? And in that communications realm, more specifically, what audiences matter most? I mean, a lot of us right now are smaller organizations. We occupy niches. Most US public opinion doesn't even know what a forced disappearance is. There's a long way to go to reaching the general public. So what is your power analysis of where are the levers for getting these stories out that matter the most? I mean, obviously the military. Obviously, the military, what am I talking about? Obviously, the media, you can tell where my mind is. Obviously, the Congress, the legislature, academia has a big role in forming public opinion about this. Organized people, Matthew Block had a good question about the sanctuary movement and the role that it could play in the United States. Sub-federal actors like Angelina Godoy has an interesting question about whether you can lean on a county airport through which the planes go to try to stop things there and shine a light on, if deportation planes or disappearance planes are going through another sub-state or local jurisdiction, how could that be useful? Allies in other countries, what are some of the more powerful audiences for getting out, information, especially now, unlike maybe, during the dirty war periods in South America, there's still a possibility of getting information out. You're not in an information blackout yet. We have the internet and social media now, but of course Mexico does too right now, and so do the people doing the disappearing. But how are those useful in a way that they might have been had they existed in the 1970s? And what's a respectful way to tell stories for people? I mean, we're hearing almost every day there's a new story about a parent separated from their child, or children with cancer being sent back to Honduras. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, so many stories are coming out now. How do we keep people from being numb, and how do we make sure that they stay? They don't just go for a news cycle and people forget until the next outrage. How do we avoid fatigue there? That was a lot of questions, but I'd really like to hear your reflections, not so much about the research and the juridical battle, but about how we change the narrative while this is still incipient. Thank you for listening to that very long question. And I would suggest we go in the same order that we went before with Mercedes first. And while you do that, I'll be concatenating all of the amazingly good questions that are coming in right now.
Yes, there were a lot of questions at the same time, but I guess I will reflect a little bit on the storytelling and what to tell and not tell. Not from a journalist point of view, because I'm not a journalist, but from the work that we normally do with families. I think it's extremely important to get the stories of families in the press, in the media, so that we all can understand better what it is, what's going on, and to understand what it is for the specific families, what they go through. But at the same time, it always has to be with their consent, obviously. I mean, because it's their decision, right? In terms of their security, how far they want to go. I think Marcela can know about different exercises in which government will also use those stories to change the stories and manipulate families, and So it becomes quite complicated as well. But with the consent of the families, I think we all benefit enormously from understanding better each of the cases and documenting them. I think that the fact that immediately the press is reacting, the NGOs are reacting, and for example, in the case of the people that have been deported to El Salvador, despite the government silence, there is much more information about who they are, and so on. It's extremely, extremely important. The deep documentation and publication of as much as possible, I think at this point it's crucial, precisely because there's not yet a complete blackout. I would just leave it there. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks. I completely agree with Mimi on this. And I would say that storytelling can begin immediately. In the case of Argentina, where there was no access to, not much access at least to press, from the beginning, the human rights organizations started collecting material. In fact, had big archives. At the end of the dictatorship, the Nunca Más report by CONADEP, the National Commission on Disappearances, was possible because of those archives that were kept. And we have now a trove of material. Every day we are inundated with information. But keeping even information only from open sources can be very useful at this point, and will be much more useful later on. I also think we need to talk more with immigration lawyers and their associations, because they know much more how to get good information, and they have contact with their clients, so they have access to what actually happens in those clandestine detentions that they are suffering right now. Obviously, it would be great to have more information on what goes on in Bukele's, hellhole of a prison, but we will eventually know more about it as well. And I am really gratified to know that all the press that I read, not only here, in the rest of the world as well, they mince no words about conditions in that prison. In addition to the fact that they are there forever, that there's no way to have contact with family or lawyers, etc. So, and I think that is reflected immediately in the public understanding of what the real dimension of the problem is. I also think it's very important to keep track of the fact-checking that is being done very effectively by many media outlets, especially to expose the lies and the misinformation and disinformation that happens several times a day, as I can see it, and to keep track of why those things are not true. My final point is that, in fact, I think because we are living in a situation where we have a lot of free expression and institutions that are working, including the courts and including organizations like the ACLU, my sense is that the public understand, and this is led by what I read about the opinion polls. The public understands instinctively what we mean when we say there's no due process. These people are not giving a chance to challenge the detention. They're not giving a chance to go before a court, etc. I think fortunately the American public understands these things more clearly than we give them credit for. Yes, there are legal technicalities, but it's not nuclear science. I mean, it's common sense. Your liberty means that you have to be able to challenge your detention. Thank you.
In my case, I can say that in Mexico, for example, when the war on drugs started and we journalists didn't know what to do, we first start organizing ourselves and training, giving some trainings from, we ask help for Colombian journalists, for example, and that trying to understand what was happening. But we create a network of with journalists of different media, for example, from the main TVs or also the alternative media. And we did these trainings to bring the victims, the stories of the victims to the to publish it, to gain some spaces for these kind of stories, because we noticed that the journalists who were publishing about it were the journalists more focused or more pro-government, and the narrative that they were publishing was more in favor of the government and not knowing about victims. So I always say that we have to do these kind of networks, but also find human stories. No, I think the Kilmar Abrego Garcia, for example, that find these spots or this data that can help the counter argument, the alternative narrative, finding these lives of the people, that they are not terrorists or they are not criminal, they are like normal people. Try to find, I don't know, different ways, the data, how, for example, the people help in the economy, no, the migrants, different facts that is important always to combat these arguments of the government, no? Also focus always in the rights, no? In the rule of law. Even if somebody has a tattoo and maybe was part of a gang, it has rights, no? We can also publish what happened in other countries or what happened in the local country, in El Salvador, for example, why the migrants have to escape, not to understand the circumstance of these people, no? And always, and I think that always look for the audiovisual support. I think that we have to find the way to go to public, just to be massive with the public. And I can see the effects of the videos, photos, camera images, satellite images, I don't know, trying to bring what we know that the influencers use. Also, we have to use the same technology and just the same to give information, because many times we are doing the same like in the 10 years ago, and the public is changed, and we have to learn these other new tools of bring attention to the people, but also we have to know whom, which is my public. If this information is for the family of the migrants, or this information is more for the public, the massive public, or this information is for the authorities, no? It depends of where we have to, where we can put our message. It depends what kind of techniques we will use to, yes, to give information, no? And take advantage of the cracks many times. And we have to be in the moment that the government made some mistake and there is a contradiction in the message or whatever. We have to bring information quickly and take advantage of the cracks, because it's the moment when the information can be positioned in the main, yes, in the mainstream. That's it.
Thank all of you for that really complete answer on communications. I can't wait to sit down and just concatenate all of that into a summary when we put out a summary of this event, because that was actually super useful for movements and many here in the United States right now. Obviously, I cannot do justice to 44 open questions in half an hour. I'm delighted that we have so many, and I apologize if in trying to summarize your question, I have lost some of the context, but it's just impossible right now. But I'm going to take several questions, and this may be our last round. And most of them have to do with research or research gaps. Catherine Gordon asked, for instance, what documentation should we be developing right now, perhaps with a possible eye to a USA Never Again Nunca Más effort at some point, but what should we be doing now in real time? Cristina Rangel asked about gaps in research needed right now in Mexico to further the work there on disappearances. Aaron Gallagher asked about sort of cross civil society between countries, connecting cooperation when abuses involve more than one state, as happened during Operación Condor, but is certainly happening between the United States and El Salvador right now, or Panama and Costa Rica. Joshua Kulak, a student, I like this question, asked about what students who like science and human rights can be, how can they be integrating themselves right now, even as they continue their own educations? How can the student movement develop with their research skills? Similarly, Courtney Siegert asked about forensic practitioners and how they can work in the United States, even as there is more backlash. Catalina Scarborough asked about navigating social media, keeping in mind a lot of the security and safety risks associated with that. You don't have to answer all of those, but I saw at least a very broad thread going through a lot of those questions about research needs and in this climate. And then finally, maybe I would leave you, if you'd like to address the question from our former executive director, Joy Olson, what do the panelists find most alarming about what is happening right now in the United States? And maybe we'll stay in the same order, which is working so well, and I'll turn it over to Mercedes. And also at this point, if you do have any final reflections, please do share them as we go into our final few minutes. Thank you again for all of your time today.
I like to be the first one all the time. Anyway, which one to tackle? I guess research gaps and forensic practices. We work at the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team. We also have a program that we've been working for the past 15 years on missing migrants. It's essentially a program that tries to create a transnational regional mechanism for migrants that go missing on their migration road to the United States from Central America, Mexico to the US. And now expanding more to the south, including the Darien Gap, and people coming through that, not only from Venezuela and Colombia, but also from some African countries, some Asian countries, and so on. There's an enormous amount of information that needs to be still be much more precise about the dimension of the problem, how many missing migrants we actually have, how many remains that are found on the migrant road may belong to migrants. How do we disaggregate data, particularly, with the ones that have disappeared in Mexico, because their fate and it's mixed with the local disappearances, and there isn't a disaggregation, a clear disaggregation, so that we can search for migrants in a more effective way instead of dealing with all the local disappearances and international disappearances happening at the same time in the same territory. We think there's a strong need to start disaggregating searches by the type of people that are disappearing, because your search is different. And one thing is to look for a person that disappeared in a state in Mexico and had no intention to migrate. So you would look to, particularly to the person could have disappeared in that state. And a different thing is to look for someone that was going to the United States and left El Salvador, and the last time he or she were in contact with a family who's in a Mexican state, and you have to, go through the entire international migration road to try to find. So one thing that we think specifically on people who disappeared in Mexico and are migrants, it's that to start disaggregating data, as part of the morgues in the south of the United States are already doing. Again, working on we never work alone. We are part of a very long, chain of organizations, both forensics and human rights and families, committees, and so on. And in the south of United States, we also have a forensic coalition that we work together with excellent forensic people, both in universities and morgues, that we're constantly exchanging information, and that is helping us. But we need way more research and disaggregation of data in order to be more effective to find these people that have disappeared in the road. I guess I would leave it there. I was more dedicated to missing migrants this time.
I would say that the most alarming aspect of the situation is the fact that high-ranking officials are hinting that they don't need to pay attention to court orders. And I hate to sound overly legalistic, but I do think that the last resort that we have in the rule of law is the independence of the judiciary. And the independence has to be understood as, when courts, issue orders within the realm of their faculties and powers, they have to be respected. I mean, the possibility that not only that they are insulted sometimes because they dare issue orders, but also the hint that maybe those orders are going to be ignored is what I think is the beginning of the breakdown of the rule of law that affected the rest of us in the whole hemisphere, quite frankly, at different times. And we learned that the hard way, and I think we have learned lessons to, maintain the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. We don't need to agree all the time with what judges say, but if we don't agree that we also have to abide by what they say, then I think we're at a very difficult moment. I'll leave it at that.
I think I answered the last question, but maybe what I can advise, it's important to be close to the collectives of the victims or the collectives who support these kind of victims, and be aware, I don't know, like trying to bring different kind of information, not only focusing one topic, I don't know, bring different angles to construct these cases and to bring attention to the public and investigate all the patterns. I remember many years ago that in a migrant hack, I saw this map that bring a lot of information of migrants who were detained by ICE and how each one were moved around the country and how these go to another country and what time and how many time they spend, how many days or weeks they spent in different jails. And I think it was impactful. So we can bring all this information and, as I saw before, move from confusion to complexity. Try to bring data to that the people that made understand that the people understand the problem. That.
Thank you. Thank you for that, for staying with us for so long and for such really, really helpful remarks that we need at this point. Why don't I hand over to Kate to say final words?
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Carolina. I think the last observation I'd like to make, because I was sort of trying to skim through the questions as well while you guys were talking and answering, is there's so many good ideas encapsulated in these questions that we couldn't begin to touch. I'm thinking of questions about sanctuary. I'm thinking of questions about responsibility, criminal responsibility for local actors in carrying out these temporary disappearances or permanent. I'm thinking about, I think it was Joshua's question about students and universities. I mean, each one of those could become a sort of motivating theme or issue to address in a future panel. So I want to say that we see all of your questions, and we're really taking seriously the urgency of this topic, of this issue. And I think we will be talking about doing future events like this so that we can bring people as expert as Marcela Turetti, Mimi Doretti, and Juan Mendez to the table to help us navigate this terrible new reality that we're living. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.